Around 1200 BC, the world was more connected than it would be again for over 2,000 years. The Eastern Mediterranean was a thriving tapestry of powerful empires, golden palaces, and complex trade networks. Great kings exchanged gifts, signed treaties, and presided over societies that seemed destined to last forever. Yet, in just a few short decades, this entire world would come crashing down in a total civilizational collapse. To understand the collapse, we must first appreciate the heights these people reached. Egypt was in its new kingdom glory. The Hittites controlled the rugged highlands of Anatolia, and the Mycenaeans dominated the Aegean with their fortress cities. These were not isolated tribes. They were sophisticated states with bureaucracies, standing armies, and a shared economy that spanned from the mountains of Afghanistan to the tin mines of distant Britain. Trade was the lifeblood of this era. In a time before currency, copper from Cyprus and tin from the East were forged together to create bronze, the high-tech material of the age. This required massive logistics. Merchant vessels like the famous Ulu Barun shipwreck carried thousands of pounds of raw metals, glass ingots, and exotic spices across treacherous seas. It was a globalized economy where every nation depended on its neighbors to survive. But this complexity was also a hidden vulnerability. This was a system of hyper-coherence, where everything was so tightly linked that a failure in one region could trigger a domino effect. If the tin mines in the East were cut off, the armies of the West couldn't make weapons. If a drought hit the granaries of the North, the cities of the South would starve. By 1177 BC, the first cracks in the foundation began to appear. The first blow may have come from nature itself. Modern science, through the study of pollen and tree rings, has revealed a massive, century-long megadrought that gripped the region. Rainfall patterns shifted, and the fertile fields that supported millions began to turn to dust. In a world without modern irrigation, this was a death sentence. As crops failed, the kings could no longer feed their subjects, and the social contract began to dissolve. Hunger leads to desperation, and desperation leads to movement. Thousands of people, displaced by famine and war, began to migrate in search of new homes. Among these groups were the mysterious Sea Peoples. They weren't a single army, but a confederation of displaced tribes, including the Peliset, the Shardana, and the Denyen. Armed with new, lighter weapons, they were a nomadic force that even the greatest empires feared to face. The migrations were not peaceful. City after city began to go up in flames. Ugarit, a wealthy merchant hub on the coast of modern-day Syria, sent out a desperate plea for help that arrived too late. Its final letter, found in a kiln where it was being baked for delivery, warned that the enemy's ships were already in the harbor and the city was burning. Within days, Ugarit was wiped off the map, never to be rebuilt. The Mycenaean world was next. These were the heroes of Homer's epics, the builders of the Lion Gate and the treasury of Atreus. But their massive stone walls couldn't protect them from internal revolt and external pressure. One by one, the great palatial centers, Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, were sacked and burned. The sophisticated writing system known as Linear B vanished as the scribes who used it were killed or fled, plunging Greece into a 400-year dark age. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, which had once fought the Egyptians to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, simply evaporated. Their capital, Hattusa, was burned so thoroughly that the stones themselves were vitrified by the heat. The central government collapsed so completely that the very memory of the Hittites was lost to history for thousands of years, until archaeologists rediscovered their ruins in the 19th century. Only Egypt, under the leadership of Pharaoh Ramesses III, managed to survive the onslaught, but at a terrible cost. In two massive battles, one on land and one in the Nile Delta, the Egyptians fought the Sea Peoples in a struggle for their very existence. Egyptian archers lined the shores, raining arrows down on the invading fleet, while Ramesses led his chariots to crush the invaders on the beaches. Egypt won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The effort of defending the kingdom exhausted Egypt's treasury. Grain was scarce, the army was unpaid, and for the first time in history, we record a labor strike by the pyramid builders. The central authority of the pharaoh was broken. Egypt would never again reach the heights of the new kingdom, becoming a prize for foreign conquerors for the next millennium. The Bronze Age was officially over. What replaced this world? A period of fragmentation and survival. With the old trade routes broken, people had to adapt. They discovered that iron, while harder to work with than bronze, was more abundant. You didn't need a global trade network to find iron. It was under your feet. This technological shift, born of necessity, paved the way for the next great chapter of human history, the Iron Age. From the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse, new cultures emerged that would define our world today. The Phoenicians became the new masters of the sea, the Israelites established their kingdom, and the Greeks eventually returned with an alphabet and a new form of government. The collapse was a tragedy, but it was also a reset, a clearing of the ground that allowed for the birth of classical civilization. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is a reminder of how fragile our systems can be. When climate change, migration, and economic disruption hit all at once, even the mightiest empires can fall. But it is also a story of endurance. We learn that when the world we know disappears, we find a way to forge a new one. The collapse wasn't the end. It was the prologue to everything that came after. While the great kings of old were forgotten for centuries, their struggle remains etched in the layers of the earth. We're still uncovering the secrets of why their world ended, and in those ruins, we find a mirror of our own era. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's greatest mysteries, a dark bridge between two worlds that forever changed the course of the human journey. Let's look closer at the environmental catalyst. Scientists have analyzed cave stalagmites and ancient lake beds, revealing that the drought wasn't a single dry year, but a 300-year period of declining rainfall. This was the Great Dry, a climatic shift that turned the breadbaskets of the ancient world into dust bowls. Without surplus food, the complex bureaucracies that managed these empires had no way to pay their officials or feed their armies. This environmental stress triggered a refugee crisis of unprecedented scale. People didn't just leave their homes, they brought their families, their wagons, and their weapons. They were looking for land that could still grow crops, and they were willing to kill for it. These weren't just marauding pirates, they were entire nations on the move, desperate and hungry, creating a wave of violence that swept across the Levant. The fall of the city-state of Ugarit serves as the perfect case study for this total collapse. Ugarit was the Silicon Valley of the Bronze Age, a center of writing, diplomacy, and trade. But when the ships of the Sea Peoples appeared on the horizon, the city was defenseless. Their own army and fleet had been summoned away by the Hittites to help defend another frontier. Ugarit was left alone to face the storm. The destruction of Ugarit was so sudden that it left a time capsule for modern archaeologists. Thousands of letters written on clay were found in the rubble. They paint a picture of a world in panic. One letter from the king of Cyprus warns, "The enemy ships are here. They have set fire to the towns and done great damage. My country is destroyed." These are the voices of people who knew their world was ending. Why couldn't the empires help each other? In the decades prior, they had been the best of allies. But as the crisis deepened, the international age fractured into every nation for itself. The Hittites were fighting their own civil wars, the Mycenaeans were fortifying their citadels against their own starving peasants, and the Egyptians were retreating behind the Nile. The collective security of the Bronze Age had evaporated. The collapse was also a technological failure. Bronze was the metal of the elite. It was expensive to make and required long-distance trade. But as the trade routes for tin vanished, the bronze industry died. The sudden lack of high-quality tools and weapons meant that the very infrastructure of civilization could no longer be maintained. Society didn't just stop, it regressed to a much simpler, more localized level of existence. In Greece, the fall was the most dramatic. The Mycenaean palaces were not just homes for kings, they were the economic hearts of their regions. They tracked every sheep, every jar of oil, and every worker. When the palaces burned, the system of record-keeping died with them. For the next 4 centuries, the Greeks would live in small villages, their great heroic past becoming the stuff of half-remembered legends. It wasn't just invaders from the sea. Internal revolts likely played a massive role. In many of the destroyed cities, there is no evidence of foreign weapons, only signs of fire and localized fighting. It's possible that as the kings failed to provide food, the common people rose up and burned the palaces themselves. The collapse may have been as much a revolution from within as an invasion from without. The Sea Peoples finally met their match in the Nile Delta. Pharaoh Ramesses III knew that if he lost this battle, Egypt would vanish. He utilized a brilliant strategy. He lured the enemy fleet into the narrow channels of the delta, where their larger ships were trapped. From the banks, thousands of Egyptian archers unleashed a literal wall of fire. The invaders were slaughtered, and the threat was finally halted. But Egypt was a shadow of its former self. To pay for the war, Ramesses had to seize wealth from the temples, causing a rift with the priesthood. The economy never recovered. The victory was a stay of execution, not a pardon. Egypt survived the collapse, but it became a hermit kingdom, no longer the world-spanning superpower that had once dominated the ancient world for nearly 2,000 years. The collapse was a perfect storm. No single factor, not the drought, the sea peoples, nor the internal revolts, could have brought down these giants on its own. It was the combination of all of them, hitting a highly interconnected system all at once. It's a sobering lesson in how complexity can become a trap. When everything depends on everything else, the failure of one part can bring down the whole. As the smoke cleared, a new world began to take shape. The survivors moved to the hills, building small, fortified villages. They forgot how to write, they forgot how to build with massive stones, but they didn't forget how to survive. This era of creative destruction allowed for new ideas to take root. Without the shadow of the great empires, smaller, more agile cultures could finally find their own voice. The most important of these new voices belonged to the Phoenicians. Based in the cities of Tyre and Byblos, they were the ultimate survivors of the collapse. They took the wreckage of the Bronze Age and built a new empire of trade. But instead of bronze, they traded in something even more valuable: ideas. They developed the world's first true alphabet, a system so efficient it would eventually be adopted by the entire world. In the mountains of the Levant, another group was forming a unique identity. The Israelites, emerging from the chaos of the collapse, established a kingdom centered on a new kind of belief system. Their stories, captured in the Hebrew Bible, would preserve the memory of the giants and the great floods that had devastated the world before them. Their culture would go on to shape the spiritual landscape of billions. And then There was Greece. After centuries of silence, the Greek world reawoke in the 8th century BC. They had lost the ability to read the old linear B, so they adopted the Phoenician alphabet to write down the poems of Homer. These stories, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were a distant, distorted memory of the very Bronze Age collapse we've been exploring. The Age of Heroes was finally born. The transition to iron was not just a change in material, it was a democratization of power. Bronze was for kings and their elite chariot warriors. Iron was for the common man. It was cheaper, harder, and more accessible. This allowed for larger armies and more independent farmers, laying the groundwork for the citizen soldiers of Greece and the rise of the Roman Republic. The collapse had broken the old hierarchies. Modern archaeology continues to piece together this puzzle. Every year, new digs in Turkey, Greece, and Israel reveal more about the burn layers, the thick bands of ash that mark the end of the Bronze Age. We use satellite imagery to track ancient trade routes and DNA analysis to follow the migrations of the Sea Peoples. We are finally beginning to hear the voices of those who lived through the end of the world. The lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is perhaps more relevant today than ever. We too live in a highly interconnected, globalized world. We too face the challenges of climate change, migration, and economic instability. The story of the ancient world tells us that progress is not a straight line. It can be interrupted. But it also tells us that even after a total collapse, humanity has an incredible capacity to reinvent itself. As we look back at the ruins of Hattusa, Mycenaean, and Ugarit, we shouldn't just see a graveyard of empires. We should see the foundations of our own world. The Bronze Age collapse was the forge in which the modern human spirit was tested and shaped. It was a dark age, yes, but it was also the crucible of the Iron Age, the Classical Age, and ultimately, our own age. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most mysterious and transformative eras. The Bronze Age collapse remains a testament to the fragility of our creations and the strength of our will to survive. Until next time, keep exploring the layers of the past, for they hold the map to our future.